episode of How'd You Think of That, Temple Grandin talks with Nalini Nadkarni, a professor at the University of Utah, where her research focuses on the ecology of forest canopies. Nadkarni's research on the interconnected systems of rainforest canopies is an apt analogy for how the different ways that people think, educate, and empower work together to create the systems that can help us address the challenges of the future.
You know, Temple, I didn't meet you in person, but I was at a TED conference. I think it was in either 2009 or 10. And I remember
2010.
Yes, so, you were there, you gave an amazing talk, and people were just clustered around you. And I went, oh my gosh, there's Temple Grandin. So that's the only contact I've had with you other than just knowing of your amazing work in general and reading about the great work that you do.
Nadkarni's emphasis on scientific public outreach led her to co-found the Sustainability in Prisons Project based in Washington. The Sustainability in Prisons Project provides opportunities for incarcerated individuals to participate in ecology-based programs designed to educate, empower, and support.
I'm really interested in understanding the effects of disturbances, physical disturbances, environmental disturbances on canopy plant communities. So I'm setting up a set of experiments where we actually cut branches, we bring them down to the ground, we hang them up in the trees, we do different treatments, and then we come back each month and we measure the vitality of the mosses that are in these different experimental locations, trying to tease out what is it about these canopy dwelling plants that when they come down to the forest floor, they inevitably die and decompose and don't do well. You know, is it the lack of sun? Is it pathogens that are on the ground and not in the canopy? Is it the physical disturbance themselves? So it's really kind of an academic experiment to tease apart the different elements that occur when disturbance happens in this canopy system. And also I do a lot of research in Costa Rica in the tropical montane cloud forest there, which is one of the most vulnerable ecosystems to climate change because the warmer sea and land surface temperatures are sort of moving up the cloud cover that is such an important factor, climatic factor, especially for canopy dwelling plants. And so we're already seeing that plants look different. They're not as well sort of conditioned, they're losing their vitality. We're seeing shifts in distribution of certain birds. They're moving up the mountain because it's drier and hotter now. So definitely we're seeing signs of effects of climate change even now, you know, and it's pretty dispiriting to see that.
Well, it's you know, you're a pioneer in this area.
I don't know about that, but I think that sounds good.
Well, and right now I kind of feel at the age I'm at now, need to be getting the young students motivated.
Yeah, that's
the big
I think
thing
all
we
of us
need to
are
be doing.
That's right.
And students have to be exposed to stuff in order to get interested in it.
That's right, because they don't know the capacity without hearing about it or seeing examples. I think you're right.
I'm more worried that a lot of students today are just too into all the technology and they're not getting out and doing enough things. And that's why I did this book with Betsy Lerner, the outdoor scientist.
Oh, wow, fantastic.
Just to get kids out. Starts out telling about rock collections my sister and I had when we were 8 and 10.
No kidding.
And they took up 2 shelves in the tool shed. The kids just aren't doing those sorts of things.
I know. I see that in my own little nieces and nephews and cousins and so forth.
And
so
when I did this book, Calling All Minds, that's my little paper airplanes and kites projects in there. 3 years ago, I did a book signing for that book, and I found out that about 20 to 30% of elementary school kids outside of Denver had never made a paper airplane.
Oh my God.
Yes.
That is unbelievable.
Yes, I am not kidding.
Everybody makes paper airplanes. And that problem multiplied as they grow up and take jobs and become parents themselves. So I think it's fantastic that you're working on this with kids.
Well, and just get them out there doing things. And
right.
I watched a kid the other day have the most interesting time studying how water came off the roof of our building.
No kidding.
I am not kidding. As a drain pipe comes down the side of our building, goes down a little concrete trough, and then before it goes into the parking lot, it goes through a slot that's in the sidewalk with a metal plate over it. And a little boy was not 3, taking the leaves out of the trough. It was clean roof water.
Yeah.
And and then running around to the other side of the metal plate to watch the water come out.
No
And see how
kidding.
that worked. And his dad was encouraging him.
Yeah,
And it's just the simplest thing.
simplest things. So are you now engaged in writing another book, or is this a
So
series?
right now, we're just finished up and sent to the editor. The editor's got right now a book on visual thinking.
I
Because
see.
I'm an extreme visual thinker. I wonder what kind of a thinker you are.
Well, you know, ever since Sherry called me up about this, I've been thinking about thinking. And I would say that I am a tapestry thinker. I really love the idea of weaving together ways of knowing from science or the arts
Yep.
or humanities or the spiritual, and weave those together with other ways of knowing. So, or other societal sectors. Like I'm in academia, I do academic research on forest canopies. So I have been trained to understand how to come to understand something as beautiful and complex as a tree or a forest through the tools and approaches of science. But I've also been, I've also thought a lot about, well, how do artists come to understand something as complex and beautiful as a tree or a forest? Or
That's
how does a
right.
logger come to understand trees and forests? How does a wood anatomist, how does a modern dancer come to understand and communicate what they understand with their ways of knowing? And what I love the most of all in the world is to take my scientific knowledge, my scientific approach, and weave that together with the ways of knowing and understanding that come from other disciplines. And to my mind, what that creates is then a tapestry. It's a tapestry that's made of threads that are of pure color. Because see, I love the idea that in science, you go really deep on something. Like I go really deep with understanding mosses that live in the canopy. And I don't want to lose that depth and that particularity of understanding those mosses. And I don't think an artist wants to lose the depth with which he or she can create an oil painting of a tree or a forest. But when you put those together, when you weave those together, when you provide a loom that can hold both the science and the art, I think you come up with a different image than one could do without the other.
Well, I think I'm a big believer in cross discipline.
I'm sure you are. And I think to me, it's not like mixing together two colors of paint, like red paint and white paint means pink paint. You lose the intensity of the red and the white. That's why I really love this metaphor of weaving together these different ways of knowing in order to come to some new image that you can still pull apart the threads, you can still keep the science or keep the art, but then what you end up with is this tapestry that's complex and connected and useful and beautiful, I think.
Yeah.
So that's what I've really tried to do, Temple, with my work is I have this basis, this thread of science that I've been developing all of my career, the last 35 years of studying trees and forests from a scientific standpoint. But in the last 10 or 15 years, I've really made efforts to try to weave together that knowledge, that way of knowing, that way of understanding and communicating with people and expertise from these other disciplines and other societal sectors. So when I characterize the way I go about trying to understand a forest or an ecosystem or a set of people or a process like disturbance and recovery, that's when I start thinking, how can I think about that scientifically, but also how can I think about that by weaving together other ways of knowing as well?
Well, my way my mind works is I like take pictures of different things, see how they relate. And they pictures of things across a discipline.
Interesting.
It can be one thing I got thinking about, I read a really interesting article about, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, it was a review of a book, and I don't remember the title of the book, but it was about plant evolution and about modern plants and more primitive types of plants and how the veins in the leaves were figured. And I looked at that and I go, this applies to supply chain management. Things like food. Because I've been saying for a long time, big is fragile. And when you break it, you're really in trouble because you don't have a more robust distributed supply chain. You have one great big plant, or you have more little plants. But when you have more little plants, it's going to be more expensive. So then I looked at, they talked about the ginkgo leaf. That just veins that come out like this. And if you damage it, there's no alternate supply chain for getting the nutrients. Where a more modern plant has a more convoluted supply chain, more expensive to build. But if you rip that leaf, there'll be another supply chain that will, or vein that will get to that part of the leaf. And as soon as I read that, I go, this is the same as supply chain management for any kind of goods. Do I have a centralized, very, very efficient, very economical, but if I break it, I'm in a lot of trouble.
Right.
Or distributed, but it's going to be more expensive.
Yeah.
It's true for plants, and plants
Right.
decided to go with the more distributed supply chain.
Exactly. That's right.
So that's an example of taking something from industry
That's
and
great.
relating it to something I read about a plant.
Right.
Now, I see pictures of both things when I think about this.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's kind of, and here's what's so interesting, Temple, is that trying to describe to someone else who doesn't have that capacity to jump from one, say, discipline or one societal sector to another, if they don't have it, how do you go about kind of giving that to them? Or does everybody have that capacity, but we've somehow smushed it?
Well, you see, so the thing I'm pushing is show how the different kinds of minds can have skills that are complementary to
Exactly.
different parts of the project.
Right, right, right. And I think in academia, which is where I've been embedded for the last 38 years, there's very much, I would say, a uniformity in the types of ways people think. Look at my department of biology here at the University of Utah, and I would say most people are, sort of linear thinkers. They're about testing hypotheses. They're about relying on data rather than intuition. And that serves very well in terms of reinforcing the system of peer review and so forth, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for truly transformative approaches or methods of arriving at an answer from a kind of a different way. Well, I think to me, I'll just share with you that for 20 years, I was on the faculty at the Evergreen State College, which was a wonderful college up in Olympia, Washington, that was founded on the basis of interdisciplinary learning and teaching. Yeah. So there are no departments, all the classes are team taught. So I taught my ecology classes with an artist or a geographer or a philosopher or a poet sometimes even, or an artist. And I learned there how to actually weave it together, these different disciplines. And in 2011, I joined the faculty here at the University of Utah, which is a very traditional R1, sort of siloed institution.
Yeah.
But I was grappling with a problem I wanted to understand in ecology, which was in the tropics, where I work a great deal. Very often you'll have a primary forest, and then farmers will cut down trees to make pastures, but they'll often leave existing standing trees that grew up in the primary rainforest in the pastures for shade or for fruit or for, they think it's beautiful, or the wood is no good, so you might as well leave it up there. And my question concerned whether these relic trees, isolated, that is, birds may not be able to fly into them to pollinate them, can they maintain their ecological roles, the ones that they played in the primary rainforest, when they're isolated?
You don't know. It depends upon how much or how isolated they are, too.
That's right.
I have read some things about patches of rainforest.
Right.
Have to be a certain size in order to maintain the ecology. What point does it be? Do you go into the unsustainable phase of it?
Right. Yeah. In ecology, in ecology theory, ecological theory, there's a lot that's being written now about the tipping point.
Yeah.
There's some point that occurs, not necessarily a disturbance, but some point in which sustainable systems become unsustainable, or the effect changes the composition or the structure or the function of components of that system in ways that are either irreversible or will take too long a time to recover, to be useful, practically speaking. So it seems like when you talk about like the food supply system, you could also be thinking about other analogous systems that might not be food supply, might be water supply. So that's really the approach that I took a couple of years ago to understand these relic trees in the pastures. And I said, well, there's no theory in ecology that talks about relic structures and how they might, but maybe in other fields that deal with disturbance and recovery, they might have some theory insight. So I contacted a traffic engineer, so traffic jams or disturbances, someone who studies refugee populations, because those are populations that have been displaced and disturbed. We had an economist who studies disturbances in economic systems. We had a modern dancer who studies disturbances to the life of a dancer when they become trained to be a dancer. We had an urban studies person who studies disaster relief, like when Katrina came through. And we all sat together for 2 hours every month and we talked about how each of us in our own fields, how does our field deal with disturbance recovery and relic structures? And I tell you, Temple, it was the most exciting set of conversations I've ever had at this university. And so the first semester, we just talked about our own fields. And then the second semester, I was going to say, okay, thanks very much, goodbye. But everybody said, no, we don't want to stop talking about this. This is so interesting. So we stayed another semester, once a month we met, and we talked about these sort of emerging principles that came out of understanding disturbance and recovery in these different fields. For instance, we came to understand that the web of relationships, maintaining that web of relationships is really important in the recovery of a disturbance. So like if a bird can cross that ocean of pasture to get to that relic tree and maintain the web of relationship with other birds in the primary forest, that tree will maintain itself and its functions in that disturbed ecosystem. So anyway, I found that this intentional crossing of threads of disciplines really led to some wonderful insights for all of us about how you can go about understanding what you're interested from your discipline, but draw upon ideas from other disciplines in order to, and it doesn't work with everything. Sometimes it's really nice just to be in your own discipline. But for me, with this idea of tapestry thinking, that to me has been the most productive way for me to sort of make breakthroughs in my own thinking rather than just follow this sort of track that most academics follow, which is read the literature, come up with a hypothesis, test it, publish it, go on to the next one, and so forth.
Well, there's also a thing in science that's very top down that say, well, you have to have a hypothesis first.
Right.
And there's also a thing where they don't think observation is science.
Right.
And I used to fight with my old professor when I was getting my PhD about this. And I go, what is the Hubble Space Telescope? It's observation.
Yeah.
What is the control? You pointed at the ground. Is that the control for the Hubble Space Telescope? Yeah, I think its ancestor was a spy satellite.
Yeah.
But basically, you are just observing.
Right.
And some of the greatest scientific discoveries have been accidental discoveries because somebody was observant.
Right. Wow. Temple, that reminds me of something else that I've been spending a lot of time on, which is trying to bring science to people that you think would not be interested in science. So I've worked a lot to bring scientists and conservation projects to people who are incarcerated in state prisons and county jails and juvenile detention centers. And, very often academics say like, oh, people who are in prison are just bad people and they're stupid and they don't have any education. But I tell you, when we brought these lectures, we've been doing this now for 15 years, where a graduate student or a faculty member, we take them to the state prison, they talk about their research, they ask, for questions, there's discussions, and inevitably these scientists walk away saying, I had no idea those guys were so smart. I got a new idea because they had this novel way of thinking about what I study in the lab. And so I'm really excited to think about, about this new way of thinking about it. And it reminded me about what you just said about looking at what seems to be nothing and finding that it's actually galaxies of stuff, maybe life even. And that's how I feel every time I bring a scientist into a prison or to people who don't have scientific backgrounds, that when you point a scientist to a prison and you say, share what you know and listen to what they might be thinking about or asking about your topic, you might find this rich galaxy of understanding that you
see, the first thing is different ways that people think.
Both Grandin and Nadkarni are trailblazers. They each have forged new paths in their fields, Nadkarni with her science education in prisons and multifaceted approach to learning and research that has won her accolades from across the world, and Grandin through her unique visual approach to agricultural facility design, the understanding of animal behavior, and contributions to a new understanding of autism and divergent thinking. They are well versed in the challenges facing the future of education and are armed with ideas and solutions.
What is your hope for the next generation of kids?
What we need to be doing is we gotta show kids interesting stuff to get kids interested in interesting stuff. That's why I did these books of kids activities. it's just so important for students to get out and experience a lot of things to find out what they might be interested in. I'm very concerned today that we're raising a generation that's totally removed from the world of the practical.
Do you think, Temple, that school is the right place? Or do you think to present that interesting stuff that kids can know? Or do you think they need to get that from their families or from after school things? I mean, sometimes I get so depressed. I've never been a teacher in the K-12 system, so I don't really know what it.
Well,
what
we
it's
went into this, we teach kids for testing.
I
But the
know,
last 5 years, I got graduate students where their writing is absolutely awful.
horrible.
Horrible. And they never wrote book reports. They never had the
I
teacher
know.
correct their work. I mean, how do you write a memo or a business letter that's decent, or
I know.
just basics? No, I think it needs to be in the schools, and we need to get the politics out of it. If I could do one thing to education, I'd put all the hands-on things back into the schools.
Yeah,
Art, sewing, woodworking, cooking,
yeah,
auto shop, welding,
yeah,
theater would be another thing. I make sure they
Right.
have theater. When
right.
I was in elementary school, I didn't care about acting in the plays, but when elementary school, high school, and college, I made scenery and costumes.
Yeah,
That was my thing.
yep. It was on the
They
makeup.
aren't trying enough stuff to see what they might get interested in. There's really cool things in citizen science. And then how do we do it if they don't have money? We've got to do things in the neighborhood. I just got back from Alexandria, Louisiana. I gave a talk to the Cattlemen's Association and a talk to all the autism parents and teachers. And it was a little theater. It was in this old warehouse. And inside was really cool, a place where they had a theater group. Well, that's something you can get kids involved in. And it's right there in the neighborhood.
Yeah,
It's something that looks like an old warehouse. You know, we need to get cleverer at finding things in the community. Get a retired mechanic to start working with some of the students on working on motors and things.
right.
You know, and then we're always going to say liability, this and that. I mean, there's a point where we've got to start doing stuff in the neighborhood, get an art club going.
Right,
There's a lot of people in the neighborhood that
right,
would be interested in this.
Right.
Another issue we have with autistic kids is getting early intervention.
right.
Not something you need to go to your church groups. You got to get some of the
Right.
grandmothers working with these kids when they're real
Right.
little.
Right,
Because an hour of therapy a week is not sufficient for 2-year-olds to
Yeah.
start talking.
right, right.
And I'm visualizing things we can do in the community,
Mhm.
and they'll say, didn't think of that.
Yeah,
They got so locked into the diagnosis, they didn't think about, I just kind of see things that they could do. I want, get them to look at things differently. And
right.
I've had people come up to me and say that somebody just came up to me at lunch and said that things he'd learned from me from cattle, and he was so proud of the way he switched his cattle pastures, stuff he learned from me. I had parents coming up to me saying, well, their kid is got a job and doing really well because of stuff I wrote or stuff that was on a video.
But I think also that what I found when I try to approach people from completely different mindsets is this finding of common ground.
That's right.
Even if you don't, even if you don't agree on everything. Like I want to try convince or interact with religious people, people of faith. There are over 80% of the people in the world self-identify as believing in God or being religious. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of people. That's more than people who are environmentalists. So I thought, how could I find common ground with religious people? I myself am not religious. My dad was a Hindu. My mother was an Orthodox Jew. Like I'm not a religion at all. But what I did was decide to read the Bible and find
one thing let me tell you I
verses.
learned in the Bible. I went on a trip to Israel probably 15 years ago or so. That word dominion over the animals,
Yeah,
I asked about 15 people in Israel what the Hebrew word was. It was stewardship.
yeah,
That has a totally different.
right.
Let's start with some really simple things. Stewardship is very different than
Absolutely, right. So I found that there were 328 references to trees and forests in the Old Testament. And then I read the Quran and the Talmud and other religious texts.
Yep.
I put together a sermon on trees and spirituality. And I started knocking on doors of churches and synagogues. And I said, could I give a sermon about what I've learned by reading your holy scriptures and what you guys think and read about trees,
Yeah.
your holy scriptures? And finally, I was able to get access to a Unitarian church. They said, okay, give your sermon. So I gave the sermon and I used as evidence that trees are important, not my scientific evidence of the ecological values of trees or how they create oxygen. But I said, in Deuteronomy 20 in the Old Testament, God tells you that you should not destroy the trees of your enemies.
Yes, I remember that. Yep.
Right? So they must be pretty darn important, right? And so we went through these biblical references and we all ended up agreeing that trees are really important to all kinds of people, including religious people. But I was able to do that without any conflict between a scientist and
That's
a religious
absolutely right. And I've done similar things going through scripture in my animal welfare book on treatment of animals.
Yes,
There are
I imagine that would be
you
really
don't yoke
useful.
a donkey and an ox together. because
Right,
They don't pull evenly.
that's right.
And I think in the Quran it has also about feeding and watering.
Yes, exactly. So by using the texts of people
That's
that
right.
already believe in that,
That's
you're not antagonizing them. In fact, you're showing that you're trying really hard to understand the world from their standpoint.
well,
And you're
that's
not
right.
trying to push them away or say you're stupid or you're different.
No,
You're trying
no.
to say, I want to learn from what you believe in.
Grandin and Nadkarni agree that while instigating real change can seem overwhelming, there's an approachable way to do it.
Who do you think are the movers and shakers in our society who could make these changes that you're talking about?
I think it's, as you talked before, one person talking at a time.
Yeah.
A whole lot of little changes.
Yeah, I do too.
That's the thing to do. I start out my stuff with cattle handling, one little project at a time, one little article at a time,
Yeah,
and things can grow. And you want, and just no, we've got to just one at a time. Every get out and do stuff.
yeah. I think that's the answer. Because I think people get overwhelmed, especially when they see such terrible things like that German flood. I always think about this as like, when you think about environmental challenges or social challenges, that we are constantly walking this knife edge between despair and hope. And if you're too despairing, if the news is too bad, you say, well, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just gonna watch TV and do my own thing. If you fall on the
Or
side
you do
of hope,
one, a whole bunch of small things.
yeah.
I
And I think if we get
better
too
way to look
hopeful,
at
yeah,
it.
we say, oh, well, everything's going to work out. Other people are taking care of it, so I don't need to do anything. So I think it's really kind of a balancing act between those two emotions. And I think the answer, as you said, is
I think we got to do a lot more local.
politicians, because they're the ones who vote for politicians. I don't like talking to policymakers. I find them very demanding of saying, is it this or that? Is it 3 species going extinct or 30? And it's like, sometimes there's no answer. So
Well,
I'd rather work at the lower grassroots level and have people change.
And then there's some things that only something really big can do. Let's look at things we use all the time. The jet airplane.
Right.
That used to be the Air Force tanker, the 707 tanker for refueling fighter jets, GPS, military.
Right.
Even the internet. The internet wasn't so expensive to develop, but GPS and the jet airplane. Now space travel now is being privatized.
I know.
But in the beginning, there's no way that could have happened. You see, you have big, huge projects like that, but then you have all kinds of things that you can just do local. Things like regenerative agriculture, for example.
Right.
I've been thinking a lot about sustainability of meat. I've worked with big slaughter plants, and we've got to get the crops and the cattle and the grazing animals together.
Right.
But you have the grazing animals graze a cover crop. You could have corn and soy and get rid of the monocultures. And if you do that, and then grazing the pastures right, you improve land. If you actually do it right, grazing animals can be used to improve land. You do them wrong, they can wreck land. And when you look at some of the stuff that's going on in the rainforest and the Amazon, the worst thing, gold mining. That is the worst.
Right.
And I didn't realize that until I really started digging into it.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Oh no, it's really bad.
Yeah.
Well, then we've got technology like satellites. Love them because I can look at stuff and they can't fake it.
Yeah, that's right.
They can't fake it. The other thing that brings about big change is when large corporations change their buying practices.
Mm.
And I had the opportunity to work with McDonald's Corporation on, this is about 20 years ago now, on implementing animal welfare standards at big slaughterhouses. We just swept through them. It was a tipping point and cleaned them up. And in this situation, it wasn't that hard because it was mainly repairs and management. They didn't have to be rebuilt.
I see.
That was lucky. But when big corporation with massive buying power says you've got to change something, you can bring about huge change. But you've got to make sure that when you use that power, you do something right and don't end up making a mess.
Right.
So you have to know enough about what goes on, practical things. The other reason it worked is I didn't make plants do stuff that was stupid.
Yeah.
And build stupid things that weren't going to work. There was a situation in Europe where they forced a poultry slaughter plant to put in a hugely expensive system for stunning chickens that did not work. They should not have been forced to do that.
Wow.
Well, you see, it got into the theory and not enough of the practice.
Right.
You know, we've got to,
Yeah.
right now, I'll be 74 in another month.
Wow.
And I need to be doing things that encourage the younger generation.
Right.
Figuring out how to do it, not with big grandiose stuff, one school at a time.
Yeah.
And write about it.
Well, you know, I did a little bit of math, Temple, because I wanted to get some evidence that doing small things, if all of us do small things, we
That's
might.
right.
So there are 325 million people in the US. There's 6.2 million scientists and engineers. So if you do the division, the math, find that if each scientist talked or had a conversation with just 52 people a year, that's one person a week, we will have had conversations with every single person in the United States. And that's not hard. Temple, it's wonderful to chat with you.
It was good to chat with you. Just great.
Yes. Okay, great.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
That was scientist Temple Grandin and Nalini Nadkarni, co-founder of the Sustainability in Prisons Project and professor emeritus at the University of Utah. I'm Jalene Bailey.
How'd You Think of That is a production of the Utah STEM Action Center in partnership with SQ Media. It is made possible by funding from the National Science Foundation's Advanced Technological Education Program.